Well, thank you for coming today, Jason. I really appreciate it. I received your book I think, from an assignment from my editor at Journal of Veteran Studies, and she said, "Hey, can you review this book? It's from somebody that we're familiar with," and so I read through it and I loved it, and so I wrote that review. And now here you are in front of me, and we're using that book for our Veterans Voices class, just as a way to sort of understand your methodology and what the ethics of it all are. So,
Well, thanks for
yeah,
inviting me. Thanks for, your generous review of the book and for assigning it. Yeah, I'm happy to talk with you.
I appreciate that. Thank you. So, we're going to start with like trauma-informed listening. So, how did you prepare yourself to listen to traumatic testimony in a way that protects both the narrator and yourself?
It's a great question. I've been doing oral histories with veterans since I was an undergrad, and I would say that I learned through experience, and then I became more familiar with like trauma theory and trauma studies and everything. So I wasn't very prepared in the beginning, and I interviewed a World War II veteran who survived Tarawa, which was the most disastrous amphibious invasion in Marine Corps history, right? And he was
Mhm.
at the he took back the Philippines with MacArthur, right? And but he had a pretty good life despite the horrors of the Pacific War and all of the brutality that you can imagine. And yet he had a really successful reintegration experience and a pretty happy life. But my experience is that following semester in interviewing Vietnam veterans were the opposite, right? Like I was talking with a friend and she mentioned that her uncle was a Vietnam vet. She knew that I was doing a project with Vietnam veterans and she asked him to do an interview with me. And, she was like his favorite niece, so he probably did it out of that. And I was completely unprepared for the realities of that experience. And in fact, that was the most difficult interview I've ever done. And for a long time, I didn't want to do anymore. He had been an alcoholic for 40 years. He served on a helicopter as a gunner. He had a broken relationship with his family. His son was there during the interview, and at one point, I just decided to end the interview and let them connect, right? Like it was, and yeah, that one remained off the record. But through graduate school, I went to a master's in English program, and I was writing about and thinking about autobiography, and so I was engaged in a lot of trauma studies. And the thing that your students need to know about trauma is that it can and does resurface. Whenever people talk about trauma, it can resurface it in their lives. Veterans are kind of a unique population, and all of the interviews in my book, that they had access to counseling services, right? And
Mhm.
so a lot of them have access to VA care, the vet center, or private counseling, and so that ensures. Or it helps to ensure that in doing an oral history interview that it won't resurface trauma that they don't have the resources and support to be able to work through it. I'm not a trained psychologist. I studied trauma, but I cannot walk someone through that process. I don't have that expertise, right? So, and then the other part of your question was about like how does trauma affect the listener? How did I prepare for that?
Mhm.
Again, I've done probably 150 interviews or more with veterans, right? And I've interviewed people who have experienced horrific trauma. And me personally, you know, stories of combat and war and death are difficult, but I've also interviewed survivors of sexual assault, people who've experienced grief and the loss of a child. And, so those are also difficult to hear. And what I would tell your students is to be aware and to know yourself and to know how that you will react and also have whatever form of self-care works for you.
Hmm.
So whenever I was a grad student, when I was writing this book, even though I had experience doing that, like life happens and other outside circumstances affect the way you react to that. I was living in Massachusetts. I had two kids. I was living on a graduate student salary, and then COVID happened. And, so yeah, I experienced depression and, all kinds of mental health from the vicarious trauma. But during the interview itself, like I felt that it was necessary for me to be a source of strength, that they could be vulnerable, not me. Right.
Yeah.
And so afterwards, it can help to drive whatever helps you process, whether it be exercise or, listening, playing the music or art or driving like me, just do whatever works for you. But also, the primary concern should always be the safety and the well-being of the narrator. I think it's an incredible privilege to do the work that I do, and I also have to keep that in check whenever that type of trauma is someone's daily life, right?
Yeah.
I'm just a visitor into that world, so I have to keep that in check too.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you. Um, so, in your interviews, how do veterans tend to navigate the tension between who they were in the military and who they're expected to be now?
Hmm, that's an interesting question. Well, it depends on the person and it depends on their background. I would say that like military masculinity can be a source of many problems for
Mm.
veterans, right? Like in the military, you're conditioned not to show weakness. You're conditioned essentially to be um, a killer, right?
Yeah.
Like that's what you're trained to do. And yet veterans and soldiers are human. They have all of the limitations that any human being has. And so, whenever a soldier experiences trauma, and it depends on the era, but overwhelmingly, even in the post 9/11 era, soldiers who had access to counseling services either didn't use them for the fear of looking weak, or
Yeah.
if they used them, they could be retaliated against for using them, right? Like that could be held against them through various forms of punishment, from stigma to ostracism to other than honorable discharges for pre-existing conditions. So even though mental health reforms have been in place in the military since 2005, 2006, I have found that the number of soldiers who are willing to seek out those services is very limited, and those who do, they experience retaliation.
Yeah.
So that creates a sense of institutional betrayal. And then whenever a veteran gets out of the military, you know, I've talked to so many Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who experienced multiple deployments, and many of them have told me in way or the other um, that whenever they struggled to come home and readjust and be a parent or a spouse, that reintegration was often disrupted by preparing for another deployment and then going back to a combat zone. And for many of them, war starts to feel more comfortable than home,
Yeah.
and those survival instincts that keep you alive in the combat zone become a detriment in your reintegration. And we could talk more about the military civilian divide and how veterans find it incredibly difficult to relate to many civilians, and I have a lot of ideas about why that may be. But yeah, I don't want to like answer every
Yeah.
question with a 10-minute answer.
No, I love this. It's great. So, when a veteran avoids a topic in an interview or changes tone or goes flat in their delivery, how do you interpret that silence?
Hmm, that's a good question. I tell every person I interview that they don't have to answer any questions that they don't want to answer. They can pause, stop, or take a break at any moment, and they'll have a chance to review everything, whether it's an audio, a video, or a transcript, right? And
Hmm.
any changes that they want made to the final collection, I make them as best as I can, right? And
Hmm.
those are the ethics in which oral historians are grounded. That's just the baseline, you know. But whenever a difficult topic comes up in an interview, I acknowledge the autonomy and the agency of the person I'm interviewing. I let them decide. Do you want to continue? If I find an opportunity, I might even suggest, like, could we take a break? And I would like to get a drink of water or use the restroom or anything so that they don't feel uncomfortable about their emotional situation. I don't want them to feel, ashamed of feeling the way they do in that moment.
Yeah.
So I take every interview differently. It's hard to have like a general rule of thumb for what I do, but what I would say is if someone is talking about a difficult topic and they become a loss of words, that means that and this is going back to that trauma theory, right? Like trauma is sometimes beyond the ability of language to communicate it, right? So
Hmm.
whenever someone goes silent in an interview, I interpret that as either they're trying to articulate or they're thinking about an answer. But if they're clearly also emotional, I recognize that the interview has gone to a place where it's no longer productive.
Yeah.
And I always have a set of questions to help guide it away, right? And that's really important too. Like there is a narrative arc to a veteran story in an oral history interview, right? And like you don't just jump in the first question, so what was combat like? Or
Yeah.
any various form of that. And like sure as hell don't ask someone, hey, what's it feel like to kill somebody? Right? Like
Hmm.
you just don't, there's certain things you don't do, right?
Yeah.
But if you take it from the beginning and you walk them through that journey, not only is it going to help navigate issues around trauma, but it's also going to help with memory, right?
Hmm.
Like you're going to guide them through that story, right? And like they're going to remember things that they haven't thought about in years. And if that interview gets to a place where it's either no longer productive dealing like with emotions or trauma. You can always like even I like to even do it physically, right? Like if someone's telling me about combat in Vietnam, I may decide to ask a question. So what did soldiers do for R&R? Where did you go? Right? Like
Hmm.
physically remove them from that combat in their memory. Like
Hmm.
tell me about Thailand,
Yeah.
you know? Just to kind of jump topics without it being obvious.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great. Um, yeah. Sometimes when I'm interviewing for like a job or something like that, I will go silent in a moment, and I have to be careful about how long that lasts because what I'm usually doing is deciding how much trauma do I inflict on this person right now, right? I get a question like, um, how do you handle stress or something like that? And I'm like, well, do I go mortar attack? Do I go, do I go, basic training? So yeah, I totally get that.
And most civilians just aren't accustomed to that, and veterans, that I've talked to at least will, whenever they're reintegrating into the workplace, some will feel like, well, no one's gonna die in my job, right? Like I'm
Yeah.
not responsible for
Hmm.
anyone's safety in this
Yeah.
position. That can be liberating, but that can also lead to other issues, right? But yeah, I think that letting um someone I usually approach an interview like a student.
Hmm.
I approach it from a place of curiosity, and I think that helps people feel like they're helping me and that I'm also deeply curious and engaged in what they have to say, and that I'm
Yeah.
learning. I'm open to what they're saying, and I'm not there for my own agenda. I don't just want them to answer my specific leading questions. I'm giving them the space to tell their story on their own terms.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really important.
Yeah. Um, One of the things I feel like civilians sometimes struggle with the military is the codes and the jargon that they use. Um, what role do you think military or institutional language plays in shaping how veterans tell their stories and how civilians misunderstand sometimes?
Ugh, man, all the jargon. Like for whenever I'm training students to do it, like the best thing that they can do is read, right? Like you
Hmm.
need, and if you don't have time to read a memoir or a biography or a history book, you can always ask them to define their terms. And I think a lot of veterans will code switch. They'll be like, well, that was FUBAR.
Yeah.
Right, and you can say like, what does that mean? And even if you do know what it means, like it's helpful to have it. And whenever there's a transcript and there's an acronym that you don't know, you can always ask the person as they're reviewing it to define it for you. Google's your best friend, but like if you know the language, then you can speak that language, and I feel like it leads to a deeper experience.
Yeah.
But then conversely, like you may have noticed in writing my book, I avoided jargon and
Hmm.
acronyms and abbreviations. I hate them in writing.
Yeah.
Like it slows it down and like, I try to define the terms I'm using every time. And, there's so many poorly written history books that don't do that. I'm like, I'm not going to decipher what you're trying to tell me here. Just tell me in plain spoken language. So that's an audience kind of thing. But it's a good question.
Yeah. When you translate a veteran's testimony for readers, like you do in your book, what principles guide your decisions on how to clarify and contextualize that language? And what do you kind of leave in its original form if you're sort of getting rid of the dialect?
Yeah, I mean, I quote directly, and
Hmm.
that's the easiest way to know that's word for word what the transcript said. Um, Transcripts are ugly though, so I might elide, I might use ellipses or em dashes to kind of show that something has been kind of removed. But I usually, I mean, as a reader, I've always loved oral history, but like I don't know, as a researcher, reading transcripts is not fun.
Yeah.
And then some oral history narratives are published as books, they've been highly edited, right?
Hmm.
And I don't know the ethical lines on that. And I'm still kind of thinking about that, right? So the best way for me to write about those stories was to provide the historical context, to be able to zoom out and zoom back in, and then interweave their words into a more coherent story, right?
Yeah.
To make it, if there's something I could summarize myself without losing the meaning, then I would. But to be honest, some of the veteran stories that I recorded, their words are far more powerful than mine,
Hmm.
I don't really like reading a lot of big block quotes. You'll notice that I didn't block quote a lot. So
Yeah.
I would introduce them. I would break up the quotes just for a readability. And there weren't many models for as I was writing this book. I was like, I kind of want to do what I appreciate as a reader, but definitely trying to uh, ha the principle is original intent, right? Like you don't take something out of context.
Right.
And if like my analysis departs from the story being told, I clarify that, right? Like, and reference historians who would contextualize it. But I think it's really important that someone tell their story on their own terms and to honor it.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Um, when you're interviewing, how do you balance the potential healing power of testimony with the risk of re-traumatizing either the narrator or the audience?
Um, Information is powerful. You get it's informed consent. Whenever I agree to interview a trauma survivor, I let them know that talking about trauma can and does resurface it, like we talked about before.
Hmm.
And I'll leave them the authority to make those decisions. And if they decide not to participate, I respect that, and I would never push it, right? And a lot of the times, people after I had done a few interviews, people would reach out to me. They
Hmm.
wanted to tell their stories, and that made
Yeah.
me feel a lot more comfortable about it. As far as the reader, I know that people may have thoughts about like content warnings, but I think that they're necessary. So I had a content warning at the beginning of the book, and then another one at a chapter on sexual violence, and that chapter for me was the most difficult to write,
Hmm.
by far the most difficult topics to and people to interview. And so I felt that it was like needed
Hmm.
an additional layer of content warning.
Yeah, I think the reader sometimes will appreciate that. Although, there is like an expected level when you're dealing with a veteran topic, I would think. Um, yeah.
And
Uh,
and also like and it's worth pointing out that like these stories are necessary to
mhm,
hear, like they can be difficult, yeah, but many of the stories I've recorded, people are not defined by their trauma. They survive it, despite the hardship and the trauma that they've faced. And many of the veterans I interviewed had transformed their lives, and they make real differences in their community. And that story is also important to hear and to know that people are not exclusively victims, right? Like they're agents of their own lives, even
mhm.
though they're sometimes constrained by these global forces that I write about, and I hope that as a writer I achieve that balance of showing individual choice and action, but also the systems in which we live.
Yeah. Um, do you ever notice that veterans are performing certain versions of themselves, either like a heroic or a stoic or remorseful or hardened, depending on the audience or the context that you're interviewing in?
Yeah. Vietnam veterans, their lives for the past 50 years have been remembered and interpreted within a political and social context, right? The most common stories that I hear from Vietnam veterans, and especially whenever they're talking to students,
Mhm.
and especially whenever they're talking to the cadets that I've trained to interview them, is about the anti-war movement and like kind of telling stories about being spat upon. But, there is no historical evidence that ever happened. And in fact, that narrative kind of comes out in the 1980s with Reagan and, kind of that backlash moment. And that's not to say that it never happened or that someone is lying or that they don't have real reasons to feel betrayed by the American public, right? But it does take on that kind of there. I mean, there's a whole lot of scholarship about victimization of Vietnam veterans and how they've been portrayed in the media, and heroes too, right? And Robert J. Lifton, who's a pioneer of trauma studies, would argue that Vietnam veterans were neither victims nor executioners, right? That people are complex, and I would apply that to the hero dichotomy too.
Mhm.
I think that civilians too often, I think they have good intentions whenever they do it, but they lionize or cast veterans as archetypes of heroes, and I think
Yeah.
that makes many veterans feel deeply uncomfortable. And I've said this before, but right, like I think that American militarism turns veterans into statues, right? And people are complex, we're not, trapped in time and stone, and whenever you like simplify a person's lived experience down to a trope, I think it's an incredible disservice. Even if it's well intended, I think it can make many people feel, I don't know, weird, you
Yeah.
know?
Hmm. For sure. When you mentioned the like Vietnam veterans feeling like they were abused when they came back, and spitting and being called baby killer and that kind of stuff. Um, when a veteran's memory conflicts with the archival record, how do you interpret that tension?
Very carefully.
Yeah.
Like I sometimes in an interview I might ask clarifying questions, but whenever I hear that, that type of narrative, I'm curious about underlying reasons for someone to embrace that type of narrative. Like, and because there are many reasons why Vietnam veterans legitimately felt betrayed,
Hmm.
from the way that the war was conducted to being marched out into the boonies and being used essentially as bait in these search and destroy operations. And then they'd be attacked and call in the air support and napalm the area. And a lot of
Hmm.
them felt like disposable bait, and
Yeah.
then whenever Vietnam veterans got home to a government that was cutting VA benefits and they had to fight for 50 years for health care and, recognition of Agent Orange, and not to mention the unemployment rates and the number of black veterans, especially who were discriminated against with these other than honorable discharges. There are many, many reasons why Vietnam veterans legitimately were effectively abandoned and betrayed. I think it's too simplistic to say it was all the anti-war movement,
Yeah.
right? In fact, a lot of Vietnam veterans led the anti-war movement, the
Hmm.
Vietnam Veterans Against the War, Veterans for Peace. So I think American politics and American collective memory have created these overly simplistic narratives about veterans. But there's real reasons why veterans are distrustful of civilians, right? They're distrustful of the VA. VA hospitals were notorious in the 1970s and 80s, but Vietnam veterans have organized and they have lobbied Congress and they have fought together for reforms to these systems for the past 50 years. It's not the kindness of politicians that have honored the troops. Like Vietnam veterans, the VVA, for example, the Vietnam Veterans of America have fought tooth and nail for those benefits. And
Hmm.
fortunately, Iraq and Afghanistan veterans kind of benefit from
Yeah.
that activism.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, what do you wish civilians understood about how veterans want to be heard?
That they wouldn't let their preconceived notions about what a veteran looks like or what they support or what their politics are or what they experienced or believed affect how they interact with veterans, right? Like if you're in an interview situation, like don't make assumptions,
Hmm.
ask open-ended questions because usually you might be surprised. You
Yeah.
know, people are diverse, there is no the veteran experience. I keep telling people that, but people keep telling me about the veteran experience. It's like, no, you're talking about millions of people.
Yeah.
People have diverse viewpoints, and rarely can people be reduced to a simple dichotomy of left or right or,
Yeah.
things like that. I think people let their politics and their media and movies kind of affect too much about how they um, and interact with human beings,
Yeah.
Read a book is what I would say.
Yeah. I know of one, right? So, um, so switching gears a little bit toward the carceral vet. Many veterans struggle with that transition to civilian life, but a lot of your narrators are transitioning from military life into incarceration, and only then into civilian life. Um, I personally had a friend. I served in First Special Forces Group, and we were both parachute riggers. And um, he deployed to Iraq and brought a digital camera with him. And he lost his digital camera. He saw it in the market, and he thought that this guy had stolen it from him, and so he stole it back and ended up incarcerated in Fort Leavenworth for it. And obviously shipped back out of Iraq. Um, how does that double transition sort of reshape the trajectory of trauma and identity and reintegration for those veterans?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in many ways, that question is at the heart of the book project from the beginning. I was curious about what was the relationship between trauma, discrimination, and incarceration.
Hmm.
And I, again, I don't think there's a simple answer. I think it's complex and it matters on an individual level. But most of the people I've interviewed, they experienced trauma before the military. The military exacerbated it, right? They might have experienced trauma after the military, and they certainly experienced trauma within a prison or a jail. Uh,
Hmm.
um, I mean, if you grow up poor in America, you've probably experienced trauma, you
Yeah.
know? So it disrupts the reintegration profoundly. I think it, comes with an additional stigma. Whatever stigma that Vietnam veterans had coming home from the war in the 1960s and 70s, it was far worse if you were incarcerated, you had a criminal record, or you were a black veteran, right? Or
Hmm.
had an other than honorable discharge. Maybe you got in minor trouble in the military and decided to take that discharge, So there's multiple layers of this, but I think in some ways, incarcerated veterans have become invisible,
Hmm.
and just like anyone in the carceral system in America, is that they exist behind prison walls, out of sight, out of mind. And whenever I give book talks, I often ask people, how many of you know a veteran, someone whose life has been affected by war? And several will usually raise their hands,
Hmm.
even though half of 1% of Americans actively serve in the military. And then I'll ask them, how many people know someone whose life has been affected by the criminal justice system? And usually half the hands will raise, right? And I often ask people to think about, what do you often hear whenever you hear about veteran reintegration problems? I'll ask you, Tony,
Yeah.
what comes to mind whenever you think about veteran reintegration difficulties?
Yeah, part of what I studied when I was getting my doctorate degree was the problem with veteran reintegration in terms of language, right?
Mhm.
That sort of barrier, and I found that 10% of the words that my veteran subjects were using were words that civilians didn't have any context for, and that's a significant barrier to communication if you're trying to tell a story. And so one of the ways that we remediated that was to teach them to code switch in different audiences. And we did performances of monologues and invited the families. And the families would almost universally say afterward that this was the first time they were hearing these stories, but often the veterans had tried to tell them before. And so that's the big barrier that I've seen a lot of, is sort of this language barrier that you try to tell somebody and they gloss over and you're like, okay, I guess you don't want to hear about it. And then you stop talking about it. And yeah, so
That's interesting. I think from a civilian perspective, that's what always fascinated me about veteran experiences, because I often felt like there was a stigma to even asking about military, right? Or
yeah.
like getting someone to talk about it, right? Um, but most people, most civilians, especially in the United States, if you ask them about name a crisis that veterans experience, you're going to hear PTSD,
Hmm.
suicide, and homelessness, right?
Yeah.
Those are, yeah, I would identify as the three big ones. But incarceration is never a part of that conversation, even though, like, if you trust the government studies, 40,000 homeless veterans a year on average, and there are far more than 100,000 veterans in prison. So,
Hmm.
and there have been since the Vietnam War. But there's a stigma associated with criminalization. And there's shame attached to it. And
Yeah.
I think that that's a huge barrier that veterans have to navigate. In addition to learning how to readjust to a civilian world, now they have a criminal record that prevents them from getting meaningful employment, sometimes VA care and benefits. And there are just so many barriers, and it builds upon it with incarceration.
Yeah. Um, your book kind of sits at the intersection of trauma and accountability. How do you approach testimony from veterans whose trauma is real and profound, but whose actions have caused harm? What does the ethical listening look like in that space?
Hmm. I think that it depends on the listener. There were
Mhm.
stories that I remember hearing a story about. And I'd already had a conversation with this person. Um, and I found out in their second conversation that he was responsible for the murder of his family, his children, and his wife. And as a father, as a parent, right? Like I, there's a limitation to my own solidarity,
Hmm.
and I felt that that was my personal limitation. I didn't continue the conversation, right?
Hmm.
Um, a shocking number of military veterans are in prison for sexual assault.
Hmm.
Um, and maybe I'm revealing too much about my politics here, but I'm not going to interview someone who is a convicted rapist, right? I've interviewed survivors of it, and that's how I kind of get at that big question.
Yeah.
But yeah, with accountability, I think that most of the veterans I've interviewed, and yes, I've interviewed many violent veterans, armed robbery, but a lot of it's drugs, drug related, DWI, violence, aggression. Sometimes it's a combination of all of the above. Um, but my project wasn't really interested in guilt and innocence. I really wanted to understand the context in which these actions happened.
Yeah.
I think that veteran treatment courts are a step in the right direction toward a reparative justice framework where they are held accountable,
Hmm.
like go into a year of court every week and intensive counseling sessions and that's a hardship. That's not easy.
Yeah.
And sometimes veteran treatment court's harder than spending a week in jail.
Yeah.
Yeah, they get their sentence expunged if they graduate, but it's not easy to graduate, right? You have to put in the work to do it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, veteran treatment court doesn't apply to all veterans, and all veterans are eligible. And I'm not going to make a claim if they should be, right? Like that's kind of beyond the goals of my work. But I do think that at the heart of my own personal conviction about criminal justice is that we should invest more in treatment than punishment.
Hmm. Yeah. I think it's especially so um, when we've subjected people to a system that sort of has that effect on people, right? It's not like we can't study veterans over history. Like, go back to Ajax. He returns home and kills his whole family with, animal parts and just, so obviously there's something there, right? That something about the war experience uh, causes people to react in that sort of way. Not saying that everybody does, but I think it's more common among veterans. So yeah, I think uh, the Veteran Treatment Court, like you, I think it's sort of onto something. Not that not that people should escape accountability, but that we should consider what they've been exposed to.
It's kind of a question that I leave unanswered in the epilogue. I point out the fact that more than half of the veterans in the federal and state prisons are convicted of violent offenses, and most civilians are convicted of drugs. And
Hmm.
why is that? And I'm not ready to answer that question. I think it is complex and it can't really be reduced to, well, they were trained to be violent,
Right,
you know. That's certainly probably part of it. But that's not all veterans are violent, right?
right,
And we know
yeah.
this. And the number of veterans who actually go to prison or end up homeless, it's just a fraction.
Hmm.
But I think that that fraction is significant enough to for us to care about.
Hmm. 100%. Um, Several of your narrators describe prison as an extension of having to be hypervigilant of the hierarchy and threat environment that they experienced in the military. How do you interpret the ways that incarceration can replicate or intensify the psychological conditions in wartime?
I mean, I think that there are negative and positive effects of that. I think that solitary confinement is cruel. I think it's torturous to someone who has experienced trauma and PTSD and who may be having a mental health crisis. And the number of veterans who And so, since the Vietnam War, veterans are more likely to serve more time than civilians for the same crime. That's a fact that's been
Hmm.
documented, right? And I've interviewed numerous veterans who spent far too long in solitary confinement. But you also put someone in a situation where they're forced to defend themselves with violence if necessary. And these are people who are trained in violence, most veterans. I mean, every veteran, right? Basic
Yeah.
training is combat, right?
Hmm.
So I think that there is a case to be made for having veteran pods and veteran wings where veterans can like be housed with other veterans, and I think that that's a safety thing, right? Like for
Hmm.
everyone. Um, but yeah, I think that I don't know. I've interviewed a lot of people, even not incarcerated veterans, who have talked about losing the structure and the hierarchy of the military upon reentry into civilian life.
Hmm.
And it's an adjustment. Like
Yeah.
you go from being up at the crack of dawn and someone telling you where to be and what to do, and everything's expected and everything's uniform, and all of a sudden you're in this crazy civilian world where like you no longer have that structure. And so the prison system and the military system are similarly hierarchical, and they do have those types of structures in place. um I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. I think it's just a fact, right? Like there are commonalities between those systems.
Hmm. Um, my students are going to be writing book reviews as part of the culminating assignment of their class. They're either going to be writing one on your book or on Sebastian Junger's Tribe or on a PDF packet that I put together of different veteran writing. Um, what do you want them to know about how authors view book reviews, how important they are to selling books, and what they sort of accomplish in the scholarship?
That's a fantastic question. So I work in publishing. I think you know that about me.
Mhm.
um I'll start with this, right? Whenever I wrote this book and published it, it started as a dissertation. I had four audience members, one
Mhm.
who actually read it, and three who hopefully said something about it, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then taking that and then writing it as a book that anyone can read was an incredibly challenging process for me that caused a lot of anxiety. The peer reviewers read the book. The copy editor read the book. My dissertation advisor read the book, and I read it a million times, obsessing over every line, right?
Hmm.
So whenever it went out in the world, I had no idea how it would be received. Your book review, in fact, was like one of the greatest compliments, right? Because it was one of the first. It was
Hmm.
really positive, but it was actually specific.
Hmm.
It wasn't vague. It wasn't just a summary, right? Like you weighed it, its strengths, its limitations, its
Hmm.
significance, right? Like that's what a good book review does.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, another person, and I won't say any names, uh, used AI to write a published book review that made shit up about the book, right? Like
Wow.
my book, you've read it, it's not
Hmm.
about prisoners of war.
No.
No, not at all. And yet they're writing about my they make many claims about me writing about prisoners of war, so like that kind of thing was very difficult, and it was retracted, it was corrected, and yet if you Google the book, it's still one of the first hits, and
Mm.
it started from like clearly a misrepresentation of the work.
Yeah.
So like book reviews are incredibly important. They rarely get done, published book reviews. The book has been received very well,
Hmm.
especially by veterans, and that's what I cared most about.
Mm.
I was like, historians, they pretty much ignored it. But veterans themselves who've reviewed it, or have written to me or like invited me to talk with them on podcasts or at conferences and things like that, they get it.
Hmm.
And many I gave a book talk at Cook County Jail, which is a infamous. jail in Chicago. And I signed books for a group of incarcerated writers, and that was one of the most positive experiences I've ever had.
Hmm.
And they weren't just reading my book, they were reading stacks of books. Like they
Yeah.
were hungry for knowledge, and that was inspiring to me, you know?
Hmm.
So I would say that I would welcome any thoughts from your students. If they just rip me to shreds, just don't share them with me.
Right.
But so far, people have been either polite or really receptive to it. And I think, you know, one of the reasons why I was anxious about it is because I'm critical. You know, I'm
Hmm.
critical of racism and
Yeah.
injustice, and so I expected a lot of backlash, but I haven't gotten it yet, and I'm grateful for that because I think that the evidence speaks for itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I do like how you sort of live in this evidentiary-based space, and it's hard to refute primary testimony followed by statistics followed by like this is what I experienced, right? So it's not something that you can confront and say, oh well, this is just his opinion. No, you've got everything laid out there, and that's really incredible. And it's obvious to me as a scholar that there's a dissertation underlying this book. Because I know what it's like, creating that reading list and then, doing your exams, and so you by the end, nobody knows more about your topic than you do, and so yeah,
The
um,
one thing I will say is that, like,
yeah,
whenever I started out this project, whenever I started interviewing undergrad or veterans as an undergrad 15 years ago, I didn't really have any preconceived political or ideological beliefs. And it was like
yeah,
the evidence and the research and the learning process shaped how I think about the world now,
mhm,
So it wasn't like I had an agenda and I was just talking to people to confirm my own bias. I was really open. And part of that, like at the beginning, I thought I was going to be writing a book about Black Vietnam veterans,
mhm,
right? And the research process unfolded, right, into including working class veterans, people with disabilities, post 9/11 veterans, Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, women veterans, right? So, like, that's the advice I would tell any student is like, be open to the ways in which research snowballs in ways
mhm.
that you can't really control.
Yeah, yeah. Is there anything else that you could share with my students that would help them either to digest your book or to respond in some helpful way in scholarship?
Hmm. I mean, like my book is not happy-go-lucky. It's
Mhm,
easy. It's not easy to read. You know, but I would say if you really want to learn and experience what these veterans live through, take breaks, and give them the space and see them as an individual in the way that I did, right? Like I didn't have just one collective voice where, their little quotes are sprinkled throughout. Like I tell their stories. Their
mhm,
stories are centered in the narrative, and I support it with evidence, right? So I really wanted their voices to resonate from the book. And yeah, I mean, just, take it one step at a time, I guess.
yeah.
What was your other question?
What can they do after digesting that book to contribute to scholarship?
God, I hope they do, like my philosophy whenever I started a research project, I had a really great mentor. He told me the point of a research project is not to revolutionize the field, but to push it forward an inch. Right? And
Hmm.
if you accomplish that, then that's fantastic. And whenever I started writing and researching about incarcerated veterans more than 10 years ago now, no one was talking about incarcerated veterans.
Yeah.
And now it seems like there are all these advocates for criminal justice reform and more research coming out and publication and programs and I'm not saying that I'm responsible for that. That's crazy.
Right.
But the fact that I contributed to that, I think is profound.
Mhm.
And what I hope is that people will take my book as a first step, and contribute to that research. And also, even if it's not about incarcerated veterans, right? Like look to the world and then ask a question, right? Don't look at the
Mm,
books and don't look at the literature to find your research gap. Look at your community. Look at the stories around you, because I guarantee you academics are not asking all of the right questions, right? So it takes someone to actually put aside the literature and look around them to know where the gap is.
yeah. Thank you, Jason, so much. You've been incredibly generous with your time and wisdom, and I hope that my students get all the way through this interview because there's a lot of good stuff right there at the end. So